Hi, this is Frosty the People with Stefan Bertram, and today we will be discussing whataboutism. Whataboutism being the thing where someone else says, have you considered that this thing is bad? And you reply to them saying yes. Well, you don't even commit to saying yes, you just say, but this other thing is also bad. And whataboutism is interesting because in some ways it seems obviously fallacious. If I say, you know, pizza is bad, and you say that donuts are bad, you seem to have just been done something irrelevant. But when placed in a certain political context, if I say we have to think of China as an oppressive nation because they have an imprisonment rate of 6.2, and you reply saying, well, the United States has an imprisonment rate of 15.2, more than double China, there does actually seem to be something of substance there. And that's because people's beliefs don't exist independently, but rather exist in a network, an association with other beliefs. Another association or a network is between me and Ben Burgess, which in this case was me being like, oh, I'm going to do it on whataboutism this week after I'd already written my notes. And then Ben being like, you read my article about this right now? And me being like, no. But on that basis, we're going to first go through Ben's article and then discuss my thoughts about the topic. Well, I will obviously discuss my thoughts as we go through, but I think it'll be interesting to discuss Ben's thoughts and then my thoughts, because his thoughts were mostly based around the situation that we had in 2022, where people were talking about Russia and Ukraine, and leftists wanted to bring up the fact that Ukraine or the West or whatever else is also bad in various ways, or to make comparisons between the invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of Iraq, and to kind of dismantle the idea that the West is terribly innocent. But what triggered me to write my notes today to have this show was, unsurprisingly, the situation in Palestine, where Zionists are engaged in whataboutism themselves. Zionists are like, oh, why are you caring so much about Gaza when what about these other things that are happening elsewhere in the world? So Ben's quite positive about whataboutism. I believe whataboutism can be positive, but I think actually concretely, it's used terribly most of the time. So I think it'll be interesting. Ben suggests discussing the crimes of our own country as well as the crimes of others is not always an effort to downplay other countries' crimes. It can be a test of whether we're serious about our principles. I think this is the basic idea, that we're never just talking about one belief that we have independent from everything else, but rather they exist together with each other alongside other things. In this case, Ben used the example of an MSNBC host saying in 2022, I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin or what he's doing in Ukraine, but it's hard for us to lecture a country about violating a country's sovereignty when in 2003 we invaded Iraq under a false pretext that we entirely made up on our own. To which he was replied with, the guy literally said, that's a great example of whataboutism, a popular rhetorical tactic going back to the USSR. It's another strange thing about the kind of received knowledge about whataboutism is that it's blamed on the Soviets, as often, many things are. And Ben first makes a very obvious point that it's very clear that this host on MSNBC does not like Russia. What he's trying to do here is not to say Russia is good, actually, or what's happening in Ukraine is not bad, actually. So what does it mean to say that his tweet is an example of whataboutism? Then Ben goes through some history, which focuses on Northern Ireland, which I don't really think is necessary for us today. Could read these words because I don't really want to see them on the podcast. But I think they do make an important point that the Soviet original the saying that became whataboutism about lynching in the United States. Ben makes the points that if we're sticking to using the name involving lynching, every use of the word would remind you that the people who were saying this did have a point. When people pointed out that the United States was lynching black people, they had a point. There was something going on there. Ben says that standard explanations of whataboutism are really examples of what informal logic textbooks called tu quo fallacy. That being, in this case, you also. The fallacy is also called appeal to hypocrisy, which hypocrisy is something that's very interesting because being a hypocrite is something which basically everyone finds incredibly morally intolerant. Well, socially and immorally intolerant, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really seem to stop people doing things, and it doesn't really seem like ultimately it doesn't matter. If I'm doing something bad, then it's bad regardless of whether I'm a hypocrite or not. And if I'm doing something good, or I'm telling you that something's good, it's still good that I'm saying it, regardless of whether I'm a hypocrite or not. In this case, person A accuses person B of doing something wrong, or they say that something is wrong, and person B refutes this by claiming that person A has done something similar, or a side they support has done something similar. The reason that this is a bad argument is even if their premise is correct, it's just not relevant. Person A can be the worst hypocrite who's ever lived and still be right when he says that person B has done something wrong. But of course, this is not what's going on. If you point out that it's hard for us to lecture a country about violating country sovereignty when in 2003 we invaded Iraq under false premises, and also condemns the war. If we stick with this sort of definition of whataboutism, then it makes no sense to claim that he's guilty of this. And interestingly, Ben does bring up here that critics of Israel's human rights abuses in the Palestinian territories are routinely accused of anti-Semitism. For example, but that does not mean that anti-Semitism does not exist, or that real anti-Semitisms don't criticize Israel, or as I'll discuss lately, the fact that Israel falsely claims that all criticisms of them have something to do with anti-Semitism is not false. I assume a great deal of the anger against Israel is kind of part inspired, nearly always, by anti-Semitism. But when you're doing a really, really bad thing, that just becomes irrelevant if you're actually guilty of some terrible fact. Kind of the deep reasons inside someone aren't important compared to dealing with the actual accusation. But Ben thinks that this sort of accusation of whataboutism based on just pointing out this irrelevant other sort of bad thing going on is not really what's going on. Hardly anyone accused of whataboutism is actually drawing the conclusion that non-American crimes being called to American ones are actually unobjectionable. So in the context of Northern Ireland, if someone's asking what about the violence of the British occupiers when discussing the violence of the IRA, was the conclusion there really that the IRA had done nothing wrong? Or was it just a really obvious point of saying, okay, like, yeah, we understand that these people are doing wrong, but you're literally also doing exactly the same thing or something very similar to us or worse? I think this is kind of the essential point that Ben makes, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think is a useful point. The point of raising such what about questions isn't to try to end the conversation, it's to try to start a real conversation. As anyone who's taught a few informal logic courses can tell you, reconstructing the arguments that people are trying to make when they're speaking loosely is tricky. It involves a lot of interpretation and certainty. But I think that, at least in a great many cases, it's a pretty straightforward alternative reading of the implied point that's being made when people engage with whataboutism. In both cases, the what about response is a way of making a counter-argument for your weight. Your enemy's transgressions don't make your cause of stopping these enemies noble. If you've committed equally bad or worse transgressions yourself, then your victory will enable you to commit more. If A says B has done wrong, and B wants to deny the charge, anything bad that A has done is just going to be irrelevant. On the other hand, if A and B are engaged in a war, and this is the point that not only do our beliefs exist within a structure, but when we're talking politically and kind of international relations-y, not only do our beliefs exist in a world with relationships to each other, but the actions of various entities exist in the relation to other entities. And A is bringing up B's misdeeds in order to portray B as the greater evil in the struggle. A recitation of A's misdeeds is extremely relevant. In fact, you can't evaluate A's claims without doing that. If we're talking about someone being a greater or lesser evil in the conflict, which with conflicts is often what we should be doing because there often is not a good side in any reasonable account, we have to engage in whataboutism in some way to do this. Take this Twitter thread with journalist Jeremy Scarhill. He starts by calling the Russian invasion a bold-faced act of aggression replete with war crimes, and notes it's rightly being condemned as such by large numbers of people and nations across the globe. He then goes on to talk about remarkably similar crimes committed by the United States and NATO in Serbia at the end of the 90s, and goes on to conclude there's no contradiction between standing with the people of Ukraine and against Russia's heinous invasion, and against the hypocrisy, war crimes, and militarism of the US and NATO. The replies to him are overflowing with accusations of whataboutism. And to be honest, Ben has a hard time believing that any of the people accusing Skyhill of whataboutism actually believes the Russian Putin apologist. They just know that they don't like when people bring up American crimes during discussions of Russian ones, and the term whataboutism captures their sense this is a bad thing to do. It's the ultimate thought-terminating cliche, and that's why Scarhill seizes on it. He expresses thoughts they want to terminate. Ben does admit that there are a few colourful characters on the fringes of the online left who find a way to combine Marxist-Leninism with the support of Russian militarism. But he would be surprised, though, if people like that make up more than 1% of the leftists who get accused of whataboutism. And it is, more often than not, leftists who are being accused of whataboutism. And this, I think, is the other kind of vital point that Ben makes here. As an American, though, my primary duty is not to speak out against the crimes committed by other governments. My own nation is one whose policies I'm in the best position to oppose, and that would be a good enough reason for me to focus on Russian crimes if I was a Russian. And this is, of course, the situation where leftists also repeat with the situation around Gaza, that the United States, and to a lesser degree the United Kingdom and other similar states, are funding very directly and arming and directly facilitating, giving intelligence, and literally doing everything they possibly can without directly intervening and bombing Gaza to support Israel's war in Gaza, compared to the situation in Sudan, for instance, which we'll discuss more when I get to it, where the West doesn't actually support either side, quite a rare thing. As an American, though, I have an especial strong duty to focus on building opposition to the imperial crimes of my own country. Not just because they're the most efficient, because he has the most ability to affect them, but because the United States is the worst for doing these crimes globally. With discussions about the parallel crimes committed by other powers providing the opportunity to drive home some of the points that are relevant about Iraq, that will no doubt become relevant all too soon about whichever country comes next, I'm damned well going to take it. Those people crying whataboutism don't like it when American crimes are brought up during discussions of Russian crimes because they don't want people to be reminded of American crimes. Once we're being honest about that, we can have a serious discussion about whether whataboutism is a bad thing. My answer would be that it depends on the intentions. As regarding the other kind of side here is making points like, if Russia and America both arm neo-Nazis, there's no reason why that can't be bad in both cases. On the other hand, the point of this particular insight about whataboutism is to argue against the view that Putin's war deserves support on the grounds that he is really fighting to denazify Ukraine, then the response is a good one. At best, I'd argue that whataboutism is actually moral imperative, and this is where Ben really comes out strong in favor of whataboutism. Think about what kind of issues, what kind of sanctions should be imposed on Russia. It's important to ask, what about the invasion of Iraq? What sanctions should have been imposed in response to that? If the EU had seized some yachts and frozen assets belonging to Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and their politically connected oil CEO friends, I would have been all favour of it. And I'm similarly in favour of targeted sanctions on Russian oligarchs. Would I support the indiscriminate sanctions and impose mass suffering on ordinary working class Americans, though? Would you? If not, then why do you support imposing them on ordinary Russians, with even less input in their country's foreign policy than we do? These are important questions because they test where our moral principles actually are and whether we believe in applying them only to our enemies or are willing to abide by them ourselves. He makes a similar point about Kosovo and then also a hypothetical invasion of Mexico. Maybe the conclusions you draw from all of these role reversals are different from mine. Fair enough. But if you aren't at least asking the what about questions, you simply aren't serious about applying morally consistent standards. Waxing indignant about the misdeeds of others' power by refusing to look in the mirror is what Vladimir Putin does when he simultaneously condemns American imperialism and wages war to keep a less powerful neighbor in his country's sphere of influence. Perhaps be better than that. And Ben says various things that I would not say there, but I quite like the article. I'm first going to go through what people have been saying in the chat and then go over to what I've written down today. Okay, actually, it turns out nothing anyone said really needed a particularly vital reply at this moment. So I'll start discussing what I've written down. I was triggered to do this episode this week, actually, again, because something to do with Ben, because that Zionist lady, the trans Zionist lady, who's also Chinese, maybe, American, she was talking about, the only reason that people don't pay attention to the siege of al-Fasher in South Sudan, well, not in South Sudan, the country, in the south of the current country of Sudan, in the south of Sudan, southwest of Sudan, is because there aren't any Jews there. They can't blame the Jews for the siege of al-Fasher. And Ben pointed out that this was obviously ridiculous. But it was particularly inciting to me because I do actually pay attention to the siege of al-Fasher in Sudan, unlike all of these Zionists, where they blatantly only bring something like this up for the sake of distracting you. What they're doing with their whataboutism as regarding Sudan is kind of the lowest form of whataboutism, where basically anything else that is happening anywhere indicts you for paying attention to a particular thing. And as I said, what I'm trying to do here is establish what are the actually good kinds of whataboutism. When is it appropriate? When does it make sense? Whataboutism, which I'm trying to use in a normatively neutral sense, as in I'm neutral on whether it's good or bad, simply for the name, is something that I understand. It's a situation where someone will bring up a certain bad thing, and you will bring up another bad thing that is not even intended to be very directly and bluntly relevant to that. For instance, someone may bring up statistics regarding the percentage of Uyghurs in prison camps as indicating China is engaged in genocide, and then someone else may reply with the fact that the percentage of African Americans in US jail is roughly similar, or was at some point in the past. If we take this as an argument that China is not engaging in genocide, then on the face of it, the argument is irrelevant. It makes no sense. There's no connection here, as was pointed out in Ben's article. Facts about the United States do not change facts about China, and both China and the US can engage in genocide. But the intended function of the argument is as such. You do not believe the United States is committing genocide, and thus you ought not to think China is committing genocide. If the examples are reasonably similar, then the argument is made entirely legitimate, based around indicating tensions in beliefs, which is a classical rhetorical strategy. But notably, this assumes and is structured around your interlocutor's position about various other issues. But this is something which is dangerous to do, on the internet, and dangerous to do generally in our times, where people are kind of increasingly becoming maddeningly diverse in the insane things they believe. There's also a certain segment of people who really don't like this argument at all, out of a sort of liberal inclination, where you should treat every issue one by one, unrelated to the each. And you shouldn't, at least in explicit terms, they don't believe that shouldn't be loyal to anything, apart from certain high-minded liberal ideas. So if you bring up American crimes, they'll be like, well, actually, I don't support the United States government, even though they don't do anything against the United States government. User pointed out that Jews are also blamed for things they aren't actually involved in, which, of course, is true. If we're trying to formalize it out, what argument is a Zionist making about Sudan? The argument is something like this. You care about what's happening in Gaza, but not in Sudan. The Jews are doing stuff in Gaza, but not in Sudan. The relevant difference between the two things here is the Jews. Therefore, the only reason you care about one and the other is because of an undue focus on the Jews. And then you go to further conclusions being like, well, actually, anti-Semitism is bad and so on. But those are the sort of hidden premises we hopefully don't need to go into. So while this is a formally valid argument, or at least one that's not obviously formally invalid, it's also at the same time not at all convincing. This is because it seems that it's hardly the only difference that's going on here. If we're even more fair to the argument, then it's of course not just about Sudan. It's a more general argument that's going on something like this. You care more about Gaza than what is happening elsewhere. The Jews are doing the stuff in Gaza, but not elsewhere, which obviously we know is also not true, because Israel is bombed like 10 countries this year or something ridiculous, maybe even more. Again, the relevance difference between the two is the Jews. Therefore, the only reason you care about one and not the other is because of an undue focus on the Jews. I'm not being someone who reads things properly in my head. I hadn't thought about how undue Jew focus sounds like. What is interesting about this argument is how it has changed over time and how reasonable it is. I think that's something that's very relevant to whataboutist arguments. It was not the case that pound for pound, Israel was the evilest country in the world prior to October 7th and prior to the genocide that was launched there. Plausibly, Israel was kind of like better than lots and lots of countries in the world. And the reason it should be focused on is because it was alongside Saudi Arabia, the other country doing really bad things that was directly supported by the United States in like a really extensive way. And that meant that the focus on Israel required like a further argument about, but I care about affecting issues about which is supported by my government, so I'm focusing on Israel and not on Sudan and blah, blah, blah. But we don't need to do that anymore. Now, things have really changed. Israel has become the number one in doing the worst thing in the world and are constantly having to be held back from doing worse, constantly on the edge of doing what is not just kind of a genocide in part, but a genocide and ethnic cleansing in totality. They would have 100% done it if they had had the chance. They constantly have the population in Gaza on the edge of starvation. They made great efforts to try to expel the population. The only reason it didn't happen was because Egypt basically refused to go along with it. So it remains the case that there are reasons unrelated to the extent of the tragedy. But another point I want to make about whataboutism is that once you're actually doing the worst thing, all arguments around whataboutism disappear. You are being correctly identified as being the matter at hand. Yes, the essay is on current affairs. The title is Whataboutism Always a Bad Thing? And I will link it in the chat. Bang. Whataboutism is interesting for being a set of arguments. Oh dear. Because of line limits, that URL was horribly chopped in half. But I think you can probably work it out how it works. Whataboutism is a set of arguments that require real reflection on the world, which is hardly rare, but is not often how the idea is treated. This sets us up to try and further develop our understanding of the concept when it ought to be applied, especially for the sake of the left. While not generally regarded as whataboutism, there's a positive example that at least follows the same verbal form. Someone will say, for instance, socialism can't work in the United States. They just mean capitalist welfarism, but that's what they say. Someone else will then reply, what about Scandinavia? This can then be disputed on various points. People will often dispute it on a very racist basis. Soon has put a much better link in the chat as opposed to my horrible one. Someone will reply, what about Scandinavia? And then like the mega racists will then reply that, well, actually, it's because Scandinavia doesn't have black people or whatever. But it's very much a valid argument. If you say the United States should have free healthcare, and someone else responds that this is unrealistic, and then you point out that all other developed nations and quite a few undeveloped ones do so, you set up a situation such that this can only be explained via great effort. Whataboutism has a great deal to do with specificity and generality, as they are always engaged in a comparison. Whataboutism succeeds or failed depending on how good the comparison being made is, and especially on whether you're properly modeling the mind and the arguments or beliefs of the person that you're speaking to, or the audience that you're speaking to. It also draws us into another question. What is the use of comparison? Why do we compare things at all? The basic point here is that our best tools for getting a grip of a certain thing or other things in the world. But the problem here is that this requires us to have a shared understanding of the world. This is very often evident when socialists try to argue for their policies and find that their comparisons don't work because their opponents live basically in a different world to the one that you do. And this often leads you in an unfortunate situation where you engage or end up engaging in a rearguard half defense of countries and politics you don't particularly like, but you aren't convinced is evil. So you'll say, I believe in communism. I don't think you should say that to any normal person unless they kind of directly prompt you and you reply. But say, you're like, oh, I'm a communist. I support communism or whatever. And you're like, then they're like, oh, wow, so that means you support starving Ukrainians to death. And you're like, no, that's not what communism means. But then you might be tempted to say, well, it probably wasn't a deliberate starvation of Ukrainians that was happening in the Holodomor, but rather a failure of long-term agricultural policies. And then you're really in the shit, because now you're defending Stalin's Soviet Union in the 1930s when you'd really be better off doing anything else. But this is a growing problem, especially generally for everyone, conservative, liberal, left and right, because our shared worlds are collapsing. We don't all watch all the same TV shows. We don't watch the same news channels, and we certainly don't read the same books. Most people don't read books. Conservatives and liberal conspiracy theories have become vastly more popular. Once they were fringe, now it's just completely normal to believe in conspiracy theories. So many liberals believe the whole shooting Trump thing from last year. Wow, it seems a long time ago, but it was only last year, about 15 months ago, I guess, maybe less. Lots of them believe that was fake, or at least were completely willing to engage with the idea that was fake. And liberals were convinced that for a while that Russians literally stuffed ballot boxes in 2016. People are placed in isolated ghettos online by sophisticated algorithms as we swift towards the so-called semantic apocalypse, where we reach a position where communication and comparisons breaks down entirely. The idea of a semantic apocalypse is where minds and concepts and ideas and thoughts about the world began to diverge so rapidly that human communication begins to collapse. Just going to check chat. Yeah, that's as much as there's various genocides, like Wikipedia genocides, we might call them, official genocides, which I deny. I deny quite a lot of genocides. I have quite a high standard for what counts as genocide. But the worst rhetorical position you can be in is accidentally putting yourself in the place where you're a genocide denier, where someone can reasonably claim that you're a genocide denier, because it remains still a powerful, powerful world. The thing's threatening that I had bad connection. Please, someone say if it's actually bad. But before any semantic apocalypse, how do we go about making comparisons and engaging in whataboutism? The most important thing I think to do here is to be Socratic. While the structure of social media incentivizes this completely, you should not immediately shoot forward and say, but the USA is also very impressive. It should only ever come after a process of working out what your opponent thinks in a public and clear way. If someone suggests that Russia is an impressive country because of their high imprisonment rates, do not just jump straight to saying, but the US also has very high imprisonment rates, even if that feels terribly obvious. You have to move to actually confirm that this person doesn't think that the US is highly impressive before you start with the whataboutism. And most importantly, be prepared to what to say when you find out they do think that. If they do agree with you that the United States is oppressive, what contradiction are you going to try and dig out, which means that they shouldn't be criticizing the prison system of Russia? Or at least, as if to go back to the Ben article, why they should be more focused on the US prison system than the Russian prison system. If there isn't a chance to do this, if your opponent isn't willing to give ground to answer your Socratic questions, then I would say just don't engage in whataboutism. Take a different tack. Just argue with them straight up. Organic OD suggests that there's a meta whataboutism problem. I don't really get that, but I do find the idea funny. You're welcome to try and explain it further, but on the face of it, I can't see how that would work. This is why the Zionist arguments are unconvincing, because it fails to properly model the people that they're engaging with, and this gets worse over time. If someone says, you only care about Gaza because of the Jews, and this ordinary normal person who's started to care about the situation in Palestine in the past 2 years because of the horrible things they've seen on social media, they're going to be like, what? No, it's not about the Jews at all. It's because I've seen kids getting blown up my timeline for 2 years. And the Zionists might say, then why are you showing these children instead of other children? But then it's very easy to reply that children are dying and everything else you're saying doesn't matter. We can then ask the question, would someone who's utterly ignorant of what a Jew is view what's going on in Gaza positively? More positive is a question, not a very agreeable question, but it's a question. But the idea that a normal person who has no idea what a Jew is would view what's happening in Gaza positively or even neutrally or anything else other than a horrendous tragedy, they aren't also enormously racist against Arabs or something, seems completely and utterly unconvincing. And so the whataboutism, what about argument fails because it completely fails to model the mind of the person it's arguing with. All right, okay. So Organic OD says, pointing out that your interlocutor isn't using bad faith whataboutism, and you're debating that instead of the original point. That is something which is totally true. Like, accusing your opponent of engaging in bad faith or pointing out like obvious errors they've made is something which might be something which is useful in kind of formal debate, but online may not be. But what I'm trying to say here is not about pointing out your opponent is doing something wrong, but you thinking about when you should be making certain arguments yourself. Stefan, really off topic, but did you receive a Kurdish name when you were fighting? Of course I did. My Kurdish name is Agit Aveshin, meaning Brave Blue River, if you put it all together. A great deal of rhetoric is not actually trying to convince the person across from you, the person you're directly arguing with, especially in the internet age, but rather is trying to convince an argument, real or imagined. I should say more like an audience you know or an audience you're predicting. So I roughly know the audience I'm talking to here. I'm aware of the views of the people who are chatting normally, but there's also kind of like a hidden audience of people who aren't in the chat who are saying things. And I try and make an average model of what they might be thinking based on what I generally know about the audience of people from Give Them an Argument and This is Revolution, where I choose like kind of the level I'm speaking at, the arguments I'm like making on the basis assumption that most people here are leftist and so on. A generic and abstract view of rhetoric would have it be the case that this does not change the sort of argument you should make. And a classic sophist view would have it that you deal with this, but use extra argument features of rhetoric and more general persuasion. This is just the idea that, you know, instead of presenting arguments that people in chat would find more convincing, I would instead decide like how determined I think you are, and then I might like try and browbeat you, or I might try to bully you, or just be like snide or whatever, you know. But moving from the abstract to the concrete, if you know your audience is other in some common way to your interlocutor, then you should address them differently. And if you know that the audience you're addressing is different, so you're saying you're debating Ben Shapiro on a college campus, but you know that your audience is liberal, you should approach that differently than if the audience is conservative or is an average between the two. And this is key if you're making whataboutist arguments. This also has to take into account that you may turn the argument off course, which is what organic OD was suggesting earlier. But there's a severe problem with whataboutism here, that you are directly making assumptions about what a likely very diverse audience thinks in terms of what they think and feel, even if it's indirectly, as you're only directly making one set of whataboutists' assumptions. That was Charlie's Ghost says, we call him Paul Guevara around here. I mean, not an argument I think I'm quite up to, not a name I think I'm quite up to, but a very, very good one. Ultimately, what whataboutism is best at, and thus the problem at the center of it, is signaling your loyalty and confederacy with people you already agree with. And I think this is the biggest thing that Ben's article did not mention. I think whataboutism can totally be used and legitimately as a proper tool of rhetoric, but it probably also is one of the worst used in terms of its actual impact out there in the world on average, in terms of actually changing minds. What's very often going on when someone criticizes another country and you're like, the United States is very bad, is not an effort to dig out contradictions in your opponent's worldview so that you can arrive at a shared consistency at the end. Rather, you're just signaling that the United States is very bad to people who think so. If someone says, Russia is doing a bad thing, and people will reply that actually the United States is doing a bad thing, I think that's more just because those people like talking about the United States doing bad things. And it's kind of the bad argument that Ben was talking about, the opposite side, where you're pointing out whataboutism for the sake of repressing. You don't want people talking about when America does bad things. It's an interesting question to ask if whataboutism will get more relevant as the future marks on. I think there are reasons to think so. There's two dimensions here. One already discussed, which is this diminishment of a shared common world of facts and feelings between people. But the other question, and the one which was very relevant to the point Ben made about criticizing your own country and your own kind of side in the world, the one that you're embedded in, is the fact that the differences between the West, the free West, or whatever you want to call it, and the rest of the world are themselves becoming diminished. That life was once clearly better in the West is largely indisputable. The question of who committed the greatest crimes is more unclear, but it was generally not directly the armies of the West after World War II. But there's not much reason to think this is true anymore. That our states are terrible and worse than other states from outside the Western power networks will become increasingly true. Ben's point here was that whataboutism is ultimately good in terms of foreign policy and seeking to refocus our comparative problems at home, and that will get more important as time goes on. And I think that is kind of the most positive thing we can get about whataboutism. That was all my words that I'd written down. This was a bit chaotic. I apologize, but just because of my timings here, things would have gone much, much better. People, please ask questions in the chat if you have them. Things would have gone much better today if I'd read Ben's article first and then written my words, but that was not what happened. I wrote my article, script, whatever, and then I read Ben's article. And I was like, I can't neglect reading Ben's article now, but it was just a very awkward situation. Yeah, I mean, Ben just discussed this as an article. He goes through the whole history. I'm generally not interested in etymology. Well, I am, but purely in like an academic sense. I think people find a great interest in digging out the history of terms. But I'm very Foucauldian about the issue. Foucauldian Nietzschean, where Foucault and Nietzsche talk about the idea that of archaeology versus genealogy. Archaeology is the idea that you dig out a concept enough, you go back and back in time, you'll finally find the real origin of it, and you'll find some grand insight into the nature of that thing, as long as you find its most original form. But this doesn't work for various reasons. For one, you're more likely finding something which has basically nothing to do with your modern concept. But also, there's no real way to actually engage in real archaeology here, because terms don't naturally kind of actually originate at some point we can find, but rather they flow back and back and back further into history in such a way that they can never really be grasped. And what you're actually doing, what you should, or actually trying to be doing, is genealogy, where you go back to a certain point and then you track the divergence which happens since. No one has any questions. I'm just going to check out what people have said recently, and then I can knock off for the night. I started playing RimWorld again. Anyone play RimWorld? Very, very good. Yeah, I guess it depends why you're interested in whataboutism. But what I was focused on today was trying to give a guide for the left in terms of when you should do it and when you shouldn't, because I think the left is constantly engaging in whataboutism, but kind of annoys people when they're doing so, kind of irritates people when they're doing so, because it seems illegitimate. They're doing it in some wrong way. I think taking a Socratic approach to it, where you don't actually just hold back. I know we all want to say the United States is very bad. The United States is very bad, and it's getting worse, especially people in it. But just hold back for a minute. Don't, when someone says another country is bad, don't immediately rush in and say the United States is also bad. Just hold back for a second and start asking them questions. And then when they give away the fact that they don't think the United States is as bad as whatever country they're criticizing, then you hit them. You hit them with the United States being bad. You might be able to hit them with actually the United States supports whatever country you're talking about is doing the bad thing. They might be able to hit them with what about the fact that the United States in some way created the kind of bad situation that's going on. You can hit them with all this stuff, but you need to hold back. You need to hold back until you can actually pin down that your opponent actually thinks something that's kind of a relevant problem to the situation. What outro should I use today? I think I might force the GTA people to listen to the heavy metal outro. I think the problem with whataboutism, and to quote, is more a problem with moralism more broadly. But that's maybe just my inner Rodriga talking. I'm interested in elaboration there, but I don't quite see it myself. It is interesting. I think you said what about aboutry sounds childish, but I was having to emphasize also just whataboutism. It sounds like I mean, it's used as an insult, right? It's not used neutrally. Whataboutism is still kind of like, it's hard to argue using that term that it's rhetorically viable to defend the idea, because the term itself is obviously something that, like, it was framed in such a way that you shouldn't be doing it. Probably we should come up with a better term for whataboutism when we're doing good whataboutism. I'm not sure what that would be. Apart from like calling it like pointing out when your opponent is clearly doing the same thing that they're accusing you of. which in itself, as Ben points out, is irrelevant. Pointing out tensions in the belief, like, I don't know what it would be. Sure, but the question is, why didn't people believe Chomsky? We can complain that, people don't agree with us, but ultimately all we have to do in that case is try harder and do better and do more. And I'm not saying, obviously, that I know better than Noam Chomsky, especially not about making arguments in the past or whatever. But we need to struggle to make better arguments, and obviously do things other than making arguments. But I would say that I'm talking on give them an argument presently, so I don't mind focusing on the arguments. Luke says, when arguing about X causing Z versus Y causing Z, is it a bad idea to describe a totalizing model that explains the observations? Seems like there might invite conspiracy theories that also totalize. I guess the question is just, is there a good argument for both sides? So, for instance, with Sudan, some people will blame the Jews for everything. So there's actual anti-Semites who will actually blame Israel for the current conflict in Sudan. But there is probably a broad frame that you can apply to the sort of situation where you discuss, the legacy of colonialism, racism, and kind of state failure. And these sort of top-level models can explain something. I thought ultimately the difference between conspiratorial arguments and non-conspiratorial arguments isn't. I don't think there's a fundamental qualitative difference between them, but rather they're all just like particular featureal. I guess you know what the word I'm trying to say. I don't know if it is a word. Like particular features that are different between each argument that makes an argument a conspiratorial one, which is false, and a non-conspiratorial one, which is true. Like there are often certain tendencies in conspiratorial arguments, such as really elaborate networks which are hidden. But overall, I think the differences aren't fundamental, but rather they're more peculiar and vary from conspiracy theory to conspiracy theory. That's true. Actually, that is probably, I think Songs 4K is correct that whataboutery, while still obviously negative, is better than whataboutism, because whataboutism implies like an ideological bent. I'm the rubber, you're the glue tactic. I don't know what that is, but plausibly you're right. I can't type it out. I can't type it out because when I do this show, I unplug my keyboard because I don't have enough USB slot. So throughout all these shows, I can't type anything, which is good because it makes me be attentive, especially when I'm here with Ben. But it also means like I can't search things like the rubber and the glue. Users is explaining what they meant when they accuse these sort of arguments as being moralistic or engaging in moralism. In the sense that morality is a malleable, self-serving product of the ruling class, therefore people aren't often moved by arguments of moral inconsistency and double standards. And getting tied up in back and forth condemnations is perhaps a rhetorical trap in the first place. I mean, this kind of goes back to the arguments I made a while ago about Palestine, Israel, where there's a temptation for the left around Palestine in Israel to fall entirely into a certain liberal humanism, because liberal humanism would massively, like if the Israelis were convinced that Arabs were equal people they could live with, and to a lesser degree if the Palestinians were convinced that Israelis were equal people they could live with, that sort of liberal humanism would immensely improve the situation in Israel-Palestine. And on top of that, there's a really strong global argument, at least in the West, a strong Western argument in favor of the same sort of view of liberal humanism, especially in the case of Palestine. But this is not the position that socialists should in the end adopt, because we aren't liberal humanists and the thing we want is not liberal humanism. We should support arguments that, even if they're completely hopeless, would actually support socialism in Palestine, Israel, or just Palestine. So yeah, I think there certainly is something there. There's something there about what you're saying about moving away from the whole realm of pointing out these sort of moralistic points. But at the same time, I don't think it's something we should entirely abandon. It's important. I guess there's 2 points to be made. There's 2 different things we could be doing. There's one thing of, should we condemn the crimes of Western imperialism and exploit the fact that all normal people think that these crimes are bad? And I would say that yes, we should do that. But there's another level to that, is then what do we do with this condemnation? What do we try and make people think from this condemnation? And the thing we should not try and make people think is all we need to then do is engage in liberal humanism. We should not say, oh, we need to engage in liberal humanism in Palestine, because, and this was the point I made in that video, was if imperialism stopped hitting Gaza so hard, the phrase, without freedom in Gaza, there's not freedom anywhere, is not just false, but it's the reverse of true. If imperialism was not hammering Gaza so hard, it would be moving its eyes elsewhere and hammering some other place hard. The reverse is true, that only through general liberation can you have general liberation. Jesus. But yeah. Only through general liberation can you have general liberation. No peculiar oppression can lead to general liberation, and peculiar oppressions can be resolved without, at least on a liberal level, can be resolved without resolving the general contradiction. Yeah, I think there's just 2 levels to it. Organic OD says arguments then need to be those that break through tribalistic supremacy's exceptionalist ideology. I think the important point is socialist is that arguments should always be socialist, but that doesn't mean that everything has to do in a really blunt way to do with socialism. You make the humanist point that people shouldn't be blown to pieces, that children shouldn't be blown to pieces. But then you immediately move to focusing on the fact that imperialism means that children will always be being blown up or dying from preventable diseases and so on and so forth. On that lovely note, actually, hold on. Does anyone have something they want me to do next week? Because I realize I have no ideas at all. Very quickly type that in the chat and then I will end the stream. I will just allow silence to go for a moment. Because it is really hard when you're streaming alone to just to not have like a minute long silence or whatever. And maybe having a minute long silence isn't that bad, but I feel like having a minute long silence, I think probably worse than a minute long silence is a minute long coughing fit. But I think a minute long silence is a really great way to get them to tune out. And I would prefer people not to tune out. Soon says, thanks, Steph. Good stream. Thanks. Soon. Organic OD. Yes, I would love to have a good breakdown of how to argue centrists who insist socialism will never work. I could do that, but I feel like that's definitely something Ben will have done before. Surely the Give Them an Argument channel has done plenty of videos on that topic, and surely Ben has written loads of articles on that topic. So if I was going to do it, I would like people to point me to those, and then I could riff on those rather than just doing it independently and repeating everything that Ben said before. I don't have a chesty cough. what actually happened was that a bit of biscuit, a bit of golden crunchies from Morrison's gluten-free, got stuck at the back of my throat, and I was just not choking, but like I was going through it with that. Why can't we say you can't prove a negative? Is that a triple negative? But you can totally prove a negative, and this is something that me and Ben have talked about on this podcast before. But I feel like that would not stretch to an hour. It would just be, well, especially because it's one of those things where I just think it's so obvious. So I would have to like get someone from chat and like have them on stream and argue it. Because I think it's really obvious that you can prove a negative. Oh, right. Sorry, you weren't talking about topics next week. You're talking about, does that apply here? I don't see the connection there. Have you read Malazan? I gave up at book like 7 of Malazan. Malazan, yeah. After we just had another cast change, and I just really couldn't be bothered. I got further than that in Second Apocalypse. Second Apocalypse, like the lore and the philosophy going on behind Second Apocalypse, is absolutely mogs everything else. But the series is so unrelentingly grim that I couldn't possibly read it. Couldn't possibly finish it. I don't ever see myself going back to Malazan either, because I really hate when a cast of character changes. My favorite thing is just having literally a single POV. And when I can't get that, I hope the cast at least doesn't rotate from book to book. Something more realism I could do, but I'd have to find an original angle on it. But yes, thank you everyone for being here today. If you have further suggestions, you can put them in the next minute as the outro plays. But until then, goodbye.